Start the session? Great. Well, Admiral Olson began the forum the other night, as you know, by talking about one element, a critical element, needless to say, but one element of DoD's involvement in Homeland Security and counterterrorism. And this panel this afternoon is intended to fill out, if not the entirety of the rest of the picture, at least to paint a broader picture of the whole depth and breadth of DoD's involvement in counterterrorism. I'll leave the moderator the task of introducing the panelists, who many of you, probably all of you know, but let me introduce the moderator. And the moderator is Kimberly Dozier with the Associated Press. Kim was with us last year at the inaugural forum. She now covers, as you know, intelligence and counterterrorism issues, and she's been a prolific writer already from the forum, and we're grateful to her for that. For many years, as we all know, she was a correspondent for CBS News covering national security issues, particularly war-related ones, and was part of a team in Iraq that suffered a car bomb. And we're delighted, needless to say, about her recovery. She wrote a memoir in 2008 called Breathing the Fire that detailed her recovery from that incident. And I should note that we have a copy of that book available, and profits from it go to Wounded Warrior veterans, and that's a tribute, I think, to Kimberly's character. So with that, Kimberly Dozier.
Thank you very much. And it's great to be back here for a second year, and I've got to say, the reason I've been writing so much is because people have been making headlines from here, and I'm hoping for the same from this panel today. I will try. I want to introduce you to everyone here, just give you a little bit of background. Retired Lieutenant General Douglas Lute, at the far end, is the Special Assistant to President Barack Obama for Afghanistan and Pakistan. Prior to that, he was the White House War Czar for Iraq and Afghanistan, advising President George Bush. That is a term he hates. That's why he's sitting over there. But what those titles, official and otherwise, mean is that if it's a war campaign that's going to heck in a handbasket, two presidents have called on Doug Lute to help fix it. Prior to those tasks, he was Director of Operations at the Joint Staff and at the U.S. Central Command, where he oversaw combat operations in Iraq and Afghanistan, and he deployed and fought in Operation Desert Storm. Those are just some of the highlights of a more than 30-year military career. Now, next in the panel, we have Paul Stockton, the Assistant Secretary of Defense for Homeland Defense and America's Security Affairs. He's responsible for the supervision of Homeland Defense activities, defense support of civil authorities, and security affairs for the Western Hemisphere. Simply put, if there's a string of terror attacks across the United States, he'll be one of the key interfaces between the Pentagon and the federal government to provide military aid in the form of manpower and logistics, and just as important, the military's expertise in fighting terrorism. He has a background on Capitol Hill covering defense, intelligence, and counter-narcotics policy, as well as foreign relations. Now, right next to me, we have Lieutenant General Guy Swann, who commands U.S. Army North. Together with the U.S. Northern Command, U.S. Army North conducts homeland defense, civil support, and security cooperation to defend North America. If the U.S. is attacked at home, his forces and resources are among the first line of defense. Now, General Swann has commanded at every level with assignments from Korea to Germany, Kuwait, Iraq, and several locations throughout the U.S. Prior to assuming his current command duties, he served as the Chief of Staff for Multinational Force Iraq, so he knows war zones where al-Qaeda operates and attacks Americans on the front lines. So with that, I would like to ask each of the panelists to give some brief remarks. I ask them to explain to us what some of these long titles mean, where they fit in Homeland Security defense, and what keeps them awake at night. Who would like to begin?
We should probably begin with the offensive side of this, right? This may be the only panel, it strikes me, that really puts all three parts of the president's counterterrorism strategy on the podium at one time. So you've got the offensive arm, the defensive arm, and then the resilience arm. So I hope that we're able to do justice to all three parts of those components of the strategy. On the offensive side, my team and I at the National Security Council are very focused on what we call the core goal against al-Qaeda. Now, this, of course, is a goal that dates back to the early days of this administration, of the Obama administration, when the president said that our core goal is to disrupt, dismantle, and eventually defeat core al-Qaeda and prevent its return to either Afghanistan or Pakistan. And in a nutshell, that really encompasses what we try to do in the White House. On the Pakistan side, of course, that core goal leads us directly to the tribal areas, the largely ungoverned or undergoverned tribal areas where core al-Qaeda still resides, even after the death of bin Laden. And in the case of Afghanistan, we're really more on the preventive side of that core goal. And this is the effort, obviously, to stabilize Afghanistan sufficiently so that it doesn't offer an attractive future safe haven or a return to safe haven in the case of Afghanistan to the same core al-Qaeda operatives who are today largely in Pakistan. I think that I'll stop there, but we basically do the offensive side, and our focus is the core goal.
Kim, you did such a good job describing my portfolio that I'd rather go to the next level of detail by talking about a couple things that keep me up at night, illustrate not only what I do, but try to engage you in some lesser-known challenges to U.S. security. First, mission assurance in the Department of Defense. Let me give you the argument. Against a smart and adaptive adversary, they'd be crazy to take on the pointy end of the spear. U.S. forces fully generated and ready for war. The smart thing would be to maneuver around those strengths, attack us in ways for which we're not prepared. Above all, attack the critical infrastructure on which the Department of Defense depends to generate, deploy, and maintain forces abroad. We're going to have a panel a little bit later on cybersecurity. That's only one component. I'd ask you to think bigger. Help you do that, I want to give you my poster child for mission assurance, and that is the electric power grid. Three characteristics of the electric power grid typify the problems and importance of mission assurance for the Department of Defense. First of all, the Department of Defense depends for over 90% of its electric power on the commercial power grid. Great dependence. Secondly, there's a lot of resilience in the electric power grid against traditional threats, not against the challenges we face today. And that includes both cyber attack, but also natural hazards that we needed to be more aware of, including severe solar events, such as the Carrington event, which, if it were to occur today, would present an enormous challenge to the nation and to the ability of the Department of Defense to execute its core missions. The third key feature, which typifies all of this enterprise of mission assurance, is the Department of Defense does not own the electric power grid. We're never gonna. We don't even have regulatory authority over the electric power grid. That resides in the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Energy. And even their regulatory power is limited for all the reasons you could understand. So my new BFFs, the North American Energy Reliability Corporation, the Energy Reliability Corporation of Texas, ERCOT, we're reaching out to industry in a way that the Department of Defense has never needed to do before because of the nature of this profoundly asymmetric threat. Second thing that exemplifies the kind of thing I do is, as you mentioned, defense support to civil authorities, but taking the security theme a little bit further, I'd like to talk for a moment about natural hazards. We're in terrific shape in the Department of Defense to support FEMA and DHS for what I call normal disasters, the kind of disasters that happen every year, every couple of years. There's a second class of disasters I want to talk about, and I'd suggest to you we need a new name for it: complex catastrophes. Complex catastrophes. This challenge was illuminated by the recent national level exercise 11. The scenario for this exercise was a 7.7 earthquake along the New Madrid Fault, which follows along the Mississippi River. We had a 7.7 event in 1812. We're ready for another one today. We're overdue. This 7.7 earthquake typifies what I call the challenges of complex catastrophes. First, the magnitude, so much bigger than anything we faced, way beyond Hurricane Katrina. Over 100,000 prompt casualties in this scenario, in Memphis, many other urban areas, compared to less than 10,000 in Hurricane Katrina, terrible as it was. So 4 FEMA regions would be affected, geographic magnitude. But aside from the magnitude, This would be a complex catastrophe because of the effects of cascading failures of critical infrastructure. FERC, the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, assessed that in such an event, electric power would go out not for days, but for weeks and months in the four-state region. No electricity. Well, think about the cascading effects. First of all, municipal water systems, they all run on electricity, don't they? People are going to get thirsty. Need water for firefighting, don't you? Second, all gasoline pumps run on electric power. Same with diesel fuel. So in terms of road mobility, of getting the relief forces in and evacuating people out, no gasoline, the cascading failures go on and on. Above all, for the response capabilities that we would have there. So there are emergency response centers, there are emergency rooms in hospitals dealing with the casualties, and thank goodness they have backup diesel fuel, and many of them, although not all, have pretty good-sized storage tanks for diesel fuel to run for a day, couple days. Great. Same with nuclear power plants, I might point out. What happens when that diesel fuel runs out? Well, they're going to call up their commercial providers for diesel fuel to fill those tanks back up. Guess what? Those phone lines are going to be busy. That's probably enough. But these are the kinds of challenges that we're working on right now, and I look forward to answering your questions.
I can only imagine the media coverage in that kind of scenario.
I guess I'm the guy that gets to execute all of that in this structure. But just a little context of where we fit into this. I command the Army or the Land Component Command under U.S. Northern Command, and in the context of the conference here, one of many organizations created in the aftermath of 9/11, along with DHS and NCTC. U.S. NorthCom stood up in 2002. We're down in San Antonio, and we do the land piece of that, and much of what Paul just described falls into the land domain. Some of the concern areas and areas we are working very carefully with Secretary Stockton as well as Admiral Winnefeld and soon General Jacoby at NorthCom. Insider threat, we've discussed some of that. Of course, the Army's been affected by the Major Hassan incident at Fort Hood and the event that occurred here over the last couple of days at Fort Hood. Insider threat, self-radicalized, but not just the Muslim dimension like Hassan, but some of the right-wing things that we've seen in Norway and elsewhere. We are seeing some of that coming after our DOD facilities, recruiting stations, and other things. So we're very concerned about protecting our resources so we can do all the things we need to do to support other government agencies. One of those agencies is CBP. We heard Mike Fisher up here yesterday. He's one of our supported commanders out in this world. We do a lot of work with he and Alan Burson and the rest of the CBP elements to provide those niche military capabilities that may not be resident in the Border Patrol or elsewhere along the northern and southern border, and I'd be glad to explore more of that with you. And the last one is Mexico. We've had just a cursory discussion here about Mexico because most of the focus has been on Al-Qaeda and the jihadist threat in other parts of the world that Doug is far more familiar than I am. But Mexico is something that we ought not take our eye off the ball on right now. The strength of the transnational criminal groups, the cartels there, is very disturbing, and of course more so because it's on our southern border. So part of our military-to-military mission in the command is to work with our military counterparts and other security forces in Mexico to complement what we do with Border Patrol and CBP and others. But as Dr. Stockton mentioned, some of the disasters he described put us in support of FEMA, Our work with Craig Fugate and all of his regional administrators is an ongoing effort. We are embedded with FEMA across the country. So this time of year, especially with hurricanes, we are joined at the hip with our FEMA partners. So that's just a snapshot, but we do a wide variety of things. My focus is completely on the homeland. No responsibility for Iraq, Afghanistan, Horn of Africa, other than monitoring what might affect us here in the homeland. We measure our success on the success of other government agencies, local, state, and federal, and we feel pretty good that we're linked in with all of those partners.
Well, I'm going to start with offense to defense again. Doug, I'd be remiss if I didn't give you a chance to say what did the bin Laden raid do to al-Qaeda, its current state, and walk us through, give us a status check of al-Qaeda, the Taliban, and the Haqqani network on both sides of the AfPak border.
Well, first, I think after hearing Paul and Guy describe their portfolios, I don't actually feel as self-conscious about mine, I suppose. They've got huge responsibilities. I think that it's been pretty well covered, I think, in previous panels, that there's no question that the death of bin Laden was a big jump along this spectrum of effects that we're trying to generate against core al-Qaeda. So as I said in the core goal, it's disrupt, which arguably we've been disrupting al-Qaeda since 9/11. Dismantle, which means take apart the machinery that allows them to project their terror outside of the Fatah, largely, and then eventually defeat. I'd argue that the death of bin Laden was sort of a jump function across that set of three action verbs, well beyond disrupt and substantially into the dismantle category. Now, I think also has been covered here by other speakers, Mike Leiter, Eric Olson, and others. We're not yet ready to declare victory here. There aren't going to be any sort of victory celebrations yet, because even with the death of bin Laden, I think I'd rate al-Qaeda core as wounded, as impeded, but not yet defeated. It's interesting to think before bin Laden. So where did we rate core al-Qaeda before May 2nd? And back in December of 10, the administration conducted a several-month review on the core goal and assessed where we were. And at that time, December of 10, we assessed that al-Qaeda core was weaker than at any time since 9/11. So 6 months later, 5 months later, we're successful against bin Laden, and I think that was a real step function, but we're not yet ready to declare defeat. Now, what's equally interesting and troubling, at least regionally, not so much internationally, outside of the region, are the affiliates, the local affiliates of al-Qaeda in the region. And this is, there are more here than I'll cite, but Kimberly mentioned the senior shura, the Taliban, the Afghan Taliban, based largely in Quetta. Al-Qaeda's in league with them. Al-Qaeda's in league probably most closely with the Haqqani network, which is headquartered in Miram Shah, just inside North Waziristan, one of the 7 agencies of the federally administered tribal areas. LET is a very important regional actor, largely focused still on India and the Kashmir problem, but increasingly we see LET, strains of LET in Afghanistan as well. This syndicate that I'm describing also includes very prominently the Pakistani Taliban, which Ambassador Haqqani is here today, and he reminded me that the U.S. and Pakistan co-sponsored the designation of the TTP under UN sanctions, and I think it was just successful a couple days ago. So, and there are many others. There's IMU, which links up to Uzbekistan. There's HUGI and others that are oriented, in some cases, on Pakistan itself, but in other cases, oriented on the export model. So either east to India and Kashmir or west into Afghanistan. So it's a very active syndicate. The bin Laden raid took a big step against the core of that syndicate, but the syndicate itself is still quite alive and well.
So if you could advise the president on where we go in Afghanistan and Pakistan with this, where would you say we need to go in the next 3 years in terms of U.S. troop levels? Is having a large number of troops there, even with this drawdown as that's on the books so far. Is that an irritant? But do we need to keep a presence there because of this syndicate?
Well, of course, we only have a large number of troops in one of the two countries we're talking about, right? So this question really just applies to Afghanistan. My sense is that large numbers of Western troops can serve a purpose in settings like this, but the purpose is pretty well defined and constrained, both in terms of mission and duration. So when President Obama came to office, we had just about 32,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan, but the situation was deteriorating. The Taliban was resurgent. And in the course of the next year, the first year of his administration, he tripled that number, leaving us, by the time of the West Point speech in December 2009, with just over 100,000 troops, either in Afghanistan or headed to Afghanistan. So we surged. This is be familiar to all of you who've watched the Iraq movie, right? Because similarly, at a time in Iraq in 2006 and 2007, when things looked especially dicey and dark, we used this tactic of a short-term, well-defined U.S. surge to knock the insurgency back and to buy time and space for indigenous forces to step up. That's exactly the tactic that President Obama announced at West Point in December of 2009, and which he just readdressed last month, I think it was on the 22nd, when he said that the surge now will be defined in duration so that it is completely recovered by the end of next summer. So large Western armies in places like Iraq and Afghanistan, in my judgment, are best employed with a well-defined goal and a well-defined sense of duration. There can't be it can't be a question of as much as it takes, as long as it takes. And in my experience, the best constraints on their employment is to provide sufficient time and space to build indigenous local forces to take their place.
Is this a shift, as so many say in Washington, to counterterrorism versus counterinsurgency, or a la what Admiral Olson was saying? It's still the yin-yang of both, but being carried out in a different way.
Right. The operations in Afghanistan today are a blend of what you might call classic counterinsurgency. So this is the pattern of clearing, holding, building, and eventually transferring to Afghan authorities. So there's a lot of that going on. Most of that takes place by way of our conventional forces that are on the ground. But that campaign is supplemented by a very robust counterterrorism-like campaign. In fact, when Admiral Olson was talking, he mentioned that there are 10 or 12 sort of JSOC quality raids going on every night. Well, those 10 or 12 are all happening in Afghanistan by and large.
JSOC, the Joint Special Operations Command.
Right, sorry, the high-end counterterrorism force, national counterterrorism force. So the operations today in Afghanistan run the spectrum from sort of classic counterinsurgency, which is then complemented by counterterrorism-like tactics by way of these night raids and so forth, but are also supplemented by a large component of civilian political and economic development programs. So it's really it's a very sophisticated blend. Now, over time, the weights of those different elements of the equation changes. So I think we're probably moving into a period where our dependence on large American infantry formations conducting classic counterinsurgency is on the wane. And that's because we used the period of the surge in Afghanistan to build and field more than 100,000 Afghan security forces. So if you ask, well, what did we buy with the West Point surge? We bought time and space to replace our surge with 100,000 Afghans. So 30,000 Americans essentially produced a dividend of 100,000 Afghans. And that's the basic logic of this, right? We'll go in for a particular period of time, limited set of missions, and hand this thing off to local forces, which are much more adept at handling these complex situations, which are still largely tribal-based and so forth, than our forces ever will be, even after 10 years of doing it.
Now, I want to take it to the next logical step. Al-Qaeda reaches our shores. Paul, I want to give you a hypothetical. Al-Qaeda or TTP militants, we're not sure which, attack a chemical plant in New Jersey. There's a cloud of gas heading for Manhattan. What do you do in the Pentagon?
First of all, we remind ourselves that in this kind of scenario, the Department of Defense will always, always be in support of the lead federal agencies who are responsible for such domestic events. So when we're looking at preparing for this toxic cloud, we'd be working very closely not only with DHS, but also with EPA and their support to the state and local first responders. We'd be preparing for the response at the same time that we'd be providing, as requested, support to law enforcement. And here, it's possible to imagine that the first thing I would think is this a one-off or is it the beginning of a campaign? Now, we're very focused on the lone wolf, the individual attacks that al-Awlaki and others are attempting to incite inside the United States. But in addition, I think we need to be prepared for the possibility of an IED campaign in the United States, a series of Mumbai-style Fedayeen attacks inside the United States, things that would require larger potential requests for assistance from law enforcement authorities to the Department of Defense. So at the same time that we'd be reaching out to the FBI, the Department of Justice, and DHS to provide support that they would request for law enforcement. That's right.
Support.
Whatever they wanted. We'd be leaning forward to make sure we could meet their requests quickly. We'd also be thinking, could this be the leading edge of something larger, and being prepared for that as well.
Now, in terms of an IED campaign, the U.S. has a lot of expertise in that developed overseas. Are you sharing that now? Are you pushing that out to local agencies?
This is an area where we need to sustain progress. On a piecemeal basis, the Department of Defense has been doing whatever it can to make sure that we can meet requests for assistance, but we've lacked an overarching framework that explains to folks like me how are counter-IED operations going to run within the constitutional framework and system of federalism in the United States. What's the overall concept of operations, if you will? And then from my worm's eye view, who's going to give me requests for assistance and what kinds of capabilities are they most likely to be requesting? So in partnership with Northern Command, we can make sure we get those capabilities there fastest. So JIADO may have capabilities built for
the joint IED defeat organization, IEDs being improvised explosive devices.
Well, we've got a lot of competitors, though, Doug. Anyway, we have a lot of expertise built up in the fight abroad. We need to be prepared now to apply that at home. But fortunately, President Obama just signed out the requirement for a national prevention framework. We have a national response framework. Now we're going to have a national prevention framework that provides that overarching vision within which DoD can be more effectively in support. We're writing that document right now with the leadership of DHS and DOJ and FBI. And anybody who wants to contribute to that effort, please bring your ideas to bear because it's terra incognito compared to disaster response.
Could I
Absolutely.
add on that? You described kind of a chemical threat, which could be man-made or as you described, terrorist. We have built and continue to build a chemical biological response enterprise within the Department of Defense, shared between the federal military and our National Guard partners to have rapid response to support FEMA or whoever the federal agency or the state authorities might be. That has been very successful. It gives us a lot of extra resiliency in this that state and locals can tap into. On the IED piece, there is a lot of training, cross-training that goes on between law enforcement and JIADO and the military quite a bit. So those lessons learned from other parts of the world are being transferred to our state and local and other federal partners.
Can I add one thing to that? The National Guard will always be the military's first responder in these kinds of events, under the command and control of governors, sometimes funded, however, by the Department of Defense. But the nation's governors recently achieved a breakthrough in policy in partnership with DOD and DHS. Now, in addition to the National Guard, for the first time, they've agreed we ought to go to Congress together, partnership between the governors and the Department of Defense, so Congress can give the President the authority he currently lacks for Title X forces, especially Title X reserve forces, who have terrific capabilities, to bring those capabilities to bear when they're in the immediate vicinity of a disaster, and those capabilities can save lives.
So you're saying Title X forces as in regular military forces that would normally be fighting wars overseas and are limited here by posse comitatus. They can't enforce U.S. laws.
Not only by posse comitatus and the constraints on enforcing law, but even for responding to disasters, natural hazard disasters. We could have an Army base filled with Title X reservists who have great capabilities right next to a wildfire or an earthquake, and we lack the authority now to use those to save lives. And in partnership with the governors, thanks to their leadership now, we'll soon be submitting legislation to Congress to give the President the authority he needs to bring those capabilities to the fight together with the National Guard.
In the post-Desert Storm time frame, we talked about the defense drawdown after Desert Storm. One of the things that force structure that changed is a lot of the kinds of things that would be needed in a domestic response were shifted into our reserve forces. So engineers, military police, chemical defense organizations are in that category, and heretofore we have not been able to access those for these types of responses.
Well, General, I have a question for you. A lot of these troops that National Guardsmen who would be pulled into these actions, a lot of them have been deployed.
Absolutely, yeah.
How do you train them or step them back from using lethal offensive measures as a first option? They're going to be, in some cases, policing Americans.
Yeah, well, this is something that we train on quite a bit. If you think of North America and more specifically the United States as a theater of operations, just like Iraq and Afghanistan, we train our soldiers, sailors, airmen, Marines to adapt to that operating environment. No different here in the homeland. We have to understand the legal constraints, intelligence gathering constraints. National Guard has to adhere to many of those constraints themselves, as well as the Title X force. But we got a glimpse of what you were talking about during Katrina, when a lot of our friends in the 82nd Airborne Division showed up in downtown in the 9th Ward with all of their combat gear on, ready to fight, and we all remember General Honore telling them to take all that stuff off because that was what they were trained to do. We've come much further now, and people understand the domestic environment as an operating area and what we have to do to be effective here. So that is occurring, both on the National Guard side as well as on the federal Title X.
Though we haven't seen it in practice yet.
Well, we train it. We were involved heavily in the national level exercise that Paul described earlier this spring. We'll get a chance, should Mother Nature throw a hurricane our way, to practice some of that. So we have adequate training and real-world opportunities to hone those skills.
Now, one of the things that jumped out at me when Admiral Olson was talking the other night about the expansion of Special Operations Command with its focus on the far enemy was he said it was now larger than the U.S. Coast Guard. And I thought, really shows you where we're putting our resources. Then Admiral Blair talked about how the counterproliferation team within the DNI is much smaller than the National Counterterrorism Center by magnitude, just a few dozen people working on this. Are we too focused because of our 9/11, tragedy and hangover on that, and we're missing other things?
Well, I'll just chime in there that at least in Northern Command and elsewhere in OSD, where Dr. Stockton is, we are taking more of an all-hazards approach as we look forward. Yes, the threats that Doug described are still clear and present, and we cannot take our eye off the ball, but there are always other threats out there, and I think we do need to open the aperture a little bit and be prepared to shift our weight in multiple directions. And as one of the insurance policies in the homeland, that's what we try to do in Northern Command. So when all things fail and things get through, you're counting on folks like us to be kind of that last line of defense. So you're right.
Doug, do you sometimes feel like the guy who gets all the toys at on Christmas morning?
I'm actually looking at the Predators, which are today deployed in support of the border police, and I'm wondering how we can get them into Afghanistan and Pakistan. But no, I mean, my team and I don't suffer for lack of resources. I mean, it's very clear that this is a focus area, so that's not a problem. It's we more have to deal with adapting those resources in innovative ways to fit the tough challenges we face. So we're not resource poor in AFPAC.
But that's what I'm saying. Do you think that that's an oversight?
I think that the administration has made an effort to try to think about counterterrorism and the threat to the homeland in sort of a complete way, a comprehensive way. And there's, recently John Brennan spoke on this in the unveiling of the new counterterrorism strategy. And he began, of course, with sort of the offensive side of this. But he was very comprehensive in his treatment of the other parts. So the multi-layered defense that is largely championed by Homeland Security, but also the great effort that Paul and Guy have talked about in terms of resilience, the response to a threat. So I really think that we've got the offense side tends to grab our attention, and I think that's really reflected in the conversations we've had so far in the conference. We've got to look at this at least in a three-part strategy and keep it balanced.
Now, you mentioned drones in the context of Afghanistan.
I mentioned his drones.
Oh, right, okay.
I actually have, I'm probably the
Petraeus,
only guy in the conference who has an active non-disclosure statement, which prohibits me from talking about anybody but his drones.
Okay. Can we talk about U.S. offensive counterterrorist operations in Pakistan without getting specific?
Well, we could talk about covert action programs.
Okay.
Largely in partnership with the Pakistani government, which is one arm of the attempt to achieve this core goal that I mentioned.
And what did you think of Admiral Blair's recommendation that we hand more over to the Pakistanis, let them put two hands on the trigger, and stop doing the, I can call them drone strikes, you can call them offensive covert action?
I haven't had a chance to talk to Dennis after his remarks, but I do owe him a pull-aside conversation because I thought he missed one dimension of this, and that is that no one denies that in the longer term, a full partnership with the Pakistani government to contend with the array of challenges they've got. And it's not just security challenges. They've got economic challenges, they've got political challenges, they've got regional challenges, east and west, that a full U.S.-Pakistani partnership is the ticket. I mean, that's our preferred alternative in the longer course. I thought the part, though, that we skipped a little bit in the previous discussions about this is that this is not just any time period that we're in right now. We're in the first 6-month period after the only succession campaign underway in Al-Qaeda, our core enemy. So we've got to take advantage of the fact that when bin Laden died, Al-Qaeda now is in uncharted waters. They've never had a succession process underway. They've never had the number 3 bump up to be the number 2. They've never had the potential shifts that we're probably going to see as a result of bin Laden's death and the things that he was very focused on, which by and large was the far enemy in Al-Qaeda terminology, to now new leaders who increasingly have over the years advocated the close fight and the more regional fight. So this is a period of turbulence in an organization which is our arch enemy. This is a period, therefore, that all military doctrine suggests you need to go for the knockout punch. So I would not adjust programs today that are designed to go for the knockout punch, especially in this window of opportunity we've got against Al-Qaeda that was delivered to us by way of bin Laden's death. Eventually, I'm all with Dennis Blair. What we need is a partnership, but I'm not ready to shift any gears in the next 6 months when we've got a chance of a lifetime.
Well, with that, I'd like to open it up to questions. And Martha's got her hand up. Beat everyone else. I'll just wait until the microphone gets there. I listened to the conference this morning streaming live, and I discovered how painful it is when people speak off mic. So.
Okay. Stand up. Okay. I'm aware of cameras, and I know that they don't want me to block the guests, so I'll just briefly say Martha Raddatz again from ABC. General Lute, what do you think would happen now if the Pakistanis had their hands with our hands on those covert programs, or those, as Admiral Olson said, the unattributed explosions. What would happen in terms of why is that such a bad thing?
Well, first of all, there's an array of programs that are underway in Pakistan. And in some cases, we're in full partnership with Pakistanis. They run the spectrum from some programs in which we're hand in hand, and other programs where we're not as cooperating. We're not in such a cooperative setting. The point that I would make is that this window of opportunity that I just described in the wake of bin Laden's death doesn't call for radical adjustment of programs that have delivered over the last couple of years. In fact, going all the way back to late 2008. And this is a time for us to double down on the opportunity to move ourselves even further along this spectrum towards strategic defeat of al-Qaeda. So I don't want to get into individual programs and so forth. Ideally, yes, we want to do these in cooperation with the Pakistanis, but we've been quite clear over the years that there are going to be some opportunities that may occur, that if they do occur, and the finding of bin Laden is the premier case, right, the classic case, that we're going to go ahead and proceed unilaterally, accepting that that's not our preferred option.
Part of this is because the U.S. doesn't trust the Pakistanis with the program, if there was such a program like the drone program?
All these cooperative programs, which range from full cooperation to little cooperation, are founded on trust. So the more that we can build up mutual trust, the more the sharing is sort of common and easy flowing, fully cooperative, the better we are. There's no question that right now we lack, on both sides, there's a mutual distrust from both the Pakistani side and from our side. And over time, we want to close that gap. We want to close. General Kiani refers to this as the trust gap. And he's right. There is a trust gap. But you can't close that overnight. And what I'm arguing is that this overnight period that we're talking about, this next 6 months, is not just any overnight. It's a critical opportunity for us to make big gains against al-Qaeda. So steady as she goes. Let's keep the fight up, and then let's look longer term towards a more full cooperative arrangement with. I promise
I'll give this up in a second, but can you just say what you think the knockout punch is? Is that Zawahiri?
I think in this succession period that there are 3 to 5 key senior leaders in al-Qaeda that, if they're removed from the battlefield, would seriously jeopardize al-Qaeda's capacity to regenerate. And therefore move us decidedly further towards defeat. Now, in military terms, defeat is a very high standard. It means not only can the enemy not perform what he wants to do, but he can't regenerate. Okay? So that's going to take a long time. And in order to get fully towards strategic defeat, we're going to have to get towards some of the root core problems that generate organizations like al-Qaeda, and that's going to be a long effort. But it's that effort that's also going to require, most importantly, this kind of cooperative partnership with Pakistan. We're not going to get inside the 45,000 madrasas inside Pakistan by way of any of the covert programs that are underway today. And this is where Denny Blair had it exactly right last night. Look, the long term, the pulling up of the roots, the addressing the core problems that generate organizations like al-Qaeda and this syndicate of affiliates in Afghanistan and Pakistan can only be done with long-term development assistance. And this goes into education, healthcare, governance, and so forth. Okay? And so that's why in the long term a cooperative arrangement that's the way to go. But there's a real tension between what we got to try to do in the short term and what we want to aim for in the long term. And that tension gets played out.
Ken? And then, Ken, you can hand it to the lady right behind you.
Thanks. Ken Delaney from the LA Times. General Lute, one of the other things Admiral Blair said last night was that an important thing to happen is for the Pakistani army to go into the Fatah. That's the way that those safe havens could be shut down. Obviously, the U.S. has been trying to get them to do that for years. Where does that effort stand right now? And do you believe they have the capacity militarily to shut down the safe havens themselves?
Well, the Pakistani army is in the Fatah. In fact, in North Waziristan, which is really the central arena of this syndicate, this enemy syndicate that I've described, the Pakistani army has 6 infantry brigades. It has a division headquarters. So it's not as though the Pakistani army is locked down on the Indian border and not engaged in the Fatah. They are. There's about 140,000 out of the 500,000 man Pakistani army who are on the Western Front, as General Kiani calls it. So they're there. The challenge is how much capacity do they have with the troops that are in a place like North Waziristan? And the answer is not sufficient to combat the syndicate. So the headquarters of the 7th Infantry Division is about 1.5 miles from the Haqqani Madrasa, which is the headquarters of the Haqqani network. So if the Pakistani army were out doing physical training one day, they would actually do their PT run past the Haqqani network and back again. That'd be kind of the halfway point on a 3-mile run. So it's not that they haven't committed to this. It really is, I think, bound by the capacity for things like helicopter support, very close targeted intelligence, and the kind of specialty forces that are going to be required to take on something like North Waziristan. I don't believe, and I don't think, certainly in the administration, we don't think that there's an imminent Pakistani campaign in North Waziristan. And it has more to do with capacity than it does will or willingness. Look, the TTP, this is the member of the syndicate aimed right at the throat of the Pakistani state. The TTP was forced out of South Waziristan, the Massoud tribal areas where they're home based. And where did they go? They went to North Waziristan. So now North Waziristan is really the center of this, to include the TTP, which actually threatens the Pakistani state itself. So look, it's in General Kiani's, there's no question, he understands the threat to Pakistan. And when he has the opening, whether it's a military opening or a political opening, to make inroads against the syndicate, especially those members of the syndicate that are attacking Pakistan, you can be sure he's going to do so. Pakistan has no sure patriot and defender of Pakistan than General Kiani.
But why haven't our billions in military aid bought them some of that capacity?
I'm sorry.
I was just going to ask the same thing. Sorry. But they just kicked out 200 U.S. military trainers. Wouldn't that have helped with capacity? And they won't let our...
No, I think what you have to some extent, we have to be willing to put ourselves in General Kiani's shoes here. Look, the bin Laden raid was a humiliation for not only the Pakistani military, but the Pakistani nation. We always imagined that the big risk with the bin Laden raid would be the embarrassment factor that bin Laden was found in a garrison city or garrison town, living in plain sight for 5 or 6 years, whatever it's been. And it turns out that we underestimated, I think, somewhat, the humiliation factor generated by the raid itself. So, I mean, from my personal logic, I would have thought that 6 years of the #1 terrorist in the world living in Abbottabad would have been sufficient embarrassment, but the 2.5-hour raid turned out to be a bigger factor. But from General Kiani's perspective, he was undercut, he was humiliated, and Pakistan's sovereignty was violated. You have to start in these problems with his perspective. I mean, we can have our perspective, and we will. But in order to crack this kind of problem, you've got to take his perspective. And so the removal of U.S. Uniformed military trainers elsewhere in Pakistan, around Pakistan, was a move on General Kiani's part to recalibrate the relationship based on the new political facts of this humiliating raid on the 2nd of May. We'll get through this. Later today, you're going to hear from Ambassador Haqqani, who's a very able voice in strategic patience in getting us through the rough parts in this relationship, so we can get to what Denny Blair was talking about, right? Which is more of a partnership. But it's a rough period. There's no denying that.
Ma'am.
Gail Harris with the Foreign Policy Association. As I mentioned when I asked a question earlier, I spent 28 years in naval intelligence, which gives me that I can't, even though I've been out a while, I can't stop red teaming some of our national security decisions. So the question I have concerns Afghanistan. I understand the philosophy behind the surge about, the goals and specific time frame. But the question I have, based on our we and our NATO allies have done a tremendous job in training up in a short period of time and training up the Afghan security forces. But there's still problems in corruption, literacy, and so forth. So the question I have is, what if it takes longer for the Afghan security forces to transition to taking care of their own country? If it starts to go south again, if the Taliban once again gain the momentum, what is our policy then? Well,
the current game plan is that we're in year one of a 4-year transition period, at the end of which, so this began in late 10, so by the end of 2014, now we propose, and President Karzai agrees, that Afghan security forces should be capable of being in the lead across Afghanistan in all 34 provinces. Your hypothetical is that, well, what if they're not quite ready? Well, there's a long time in the next 3.5 years here to make mid-course adjustments on the strategy. So we're taking this sort of a bite at a time. The first increment of adjustment, recalibration, if you will, came by way of the President's speech on the 22nd of June, when he announced that about 33,000 Americans will be coming out over the course of the next 14 months. But at the end of that 14-month period, there are going to be 68,000 Americans there. And the sense is that this is the time for Afghanistan to step up, and that the Afghan National Security Forces, which have been fielded, trained, and equipped, must now step forward and assume the security lead. They should do that now, while we still will have 68,000 American troops there to backstop them. So we're into pushing forward, pressing forward, being aggressive by way of transition. Why? Because right now we've got quite a big insurance policy that's still there on the ground. And there's no denying that we may have to deal with hypotheticals downstream, but we think we have enough resilience with that number of troops on the ground to be adaptive.
Okay. Do we have a Homeland Security question?
Please.
You, sir.
Thank you, Stephen Shapiro. For Dr. Stockton, I was fascinated by the description of your duties and also totally confused by your office as a result. Almost everything that you described seems to fall within another agency's domain. From energy security, cybersecurity, FEMA, you name it, it ain't DOD. So I'm just curious, as a student of our government and a watcher of DOD, what the heck do you really do and why are you doing this?
My job is to get told what to do by the partners whom we support. So above all, Craig Fugate at FEMA, my other friends in DHS, FBI, and the Department of Justice, many other agencies. DOD's role in the homeland always will be limited and should remain limited. But the fact is, folks, we've got a lot of the Schlitz, in part because of the work we've done abroad, in part because of the presence of so many highly trained and qualified personnel here at home before they deploy abroad. We need to be able to make sure that that goodness, that capacity can be brought to bear in support of the lead federal agencies when they request it. And above all, when governors go to these lead federal agencies and ask for assistance. We need to stand ready to provide what's requested. So it's a challenge for me. I have a lot of responsibility and no authority. That's a classic good thing, isn't it, fellas? Right? And we fight through that. It's a degree of complexity that is fascinating for me as a political scientist. I'm used to the interagency, right, and all the ugliness that prevails there. But interagency, horizontal integration is easy. It's that vertical integration, recognizing that governors are sovereign and they have primary responsibility for the public safety of their citizens. How do you build a system where governors are in the lead, we're in support of them via FEMA, and incidentally, mayors don't work for governors and they often don't get along. It's that vertical complexity together with the private sector that creates such a fascinating opportunity for policy development and innovation.
General Swann, do you have anything to add to that?
I would add, let me just add to that. We are not a lead federal agency, and we are in support, as Paul mentioned, but we're there for the more catastrophic events, the ones that are above and beyond what local and state authorities can handle. I personally believe that there are events out there that no single jurisdiction, agency, or department can handle on its own. The Department of Defense has a lot of wherewithal that I think all of you as citizens would expect would be at the call of those first responders. So yes, we are an insurance policy in backing up other agencies of the government. In defense of my colleague here, we're not doing other people's jobs. What we're doing is making sure that they're successful at doing their jobs.
So just to be clear, this is I'm not being critical, I just really do need to understand that this is a very creative and I think novel, new approach to how to bring the resources of the biggest and most well-funded agency we have that's traditionally not been domestic to the domestic agencies which have been starved of resources but have all the responsibility. I mean, that's essentially what we're talking about. You've got the Schlitz, they've got the authority, and you probably spend a lot of time with lawyers then trying to figure out how to get your stuff to their needs. I don't mean to belabor this, but just to be clear.
I have two attorneys who sit right out in front of my desk,
right.
And I ask them, how's it going today? And they say, sir, you're pre-indicted. but I would say this.
But you're probably pre-pardoned as well, so.
Don't know about that one. Hope it's true. I would say this. We're familiar with the construct of defense support to civil authorities, which is the focus of your question. I'd like to challenge you. Let's think harder about civilian support to defense. We depend every day on the FBI and the Department of Justice for the flow of information to the base commander at Fort Hood in order to deal with the threats of terrorism at home. The Department of Defense is not going to be gathering this information or storing it. We need support from the civilian agencies, and we're working that one hard. But again, it's a novel challenge and not one that the Cold War left us prepared to handle.
Could I add one thing? And this is maybe counterintuitive to a lot of people in the audience, but the conflicts that Doug has described and been involved in over the last 10 years has built up a knowledge base within our armed forces on planning, training, equipping to fight a variety of threats that we often find ourselves in a capacity building role with our federal partners, specifically with Border Patrol and others, just agencies that have not had a planning culture or a training culture over the course of their existence. So we play an advise and assist role just as we do overseas with our own federal partners.
One last question from Mr. Isikoff. This will send us home. Right in the center of the room. Let's see which microphone reads them first.
Thanks. Mike Isikoff with NBC News. Question for the General. I wonder if you can identify for us those 3 to 5 senior members of Al-Qaeda. You said a knockout blow could be delivered, and how optimistic are you that that blow can be delivered in the next 6 months?
Well, I think it's less important to share them with you than to tell you that we have shared them with our Pakistani partners, and that the United States and Pakistan have a common view on who these small handful, less than a full handful are. I mean, some are common names. Zawahiri is obviously high on that list. And it's our sense that cooperation against these small handful of high-value targets is one of the big arenas of common interest that we have with Pakistan. Now, there are others. A peaceful, stable Afghanistan is in Pakistan's interest. Lowering the tensions between India and Pakistan is in Pakistan's interest. But taking on this last core element of Al-Qaeda is also in Pakistan's interest. So if I have optimism here, if there's optimism on this account, it is that we actually have pretty significant overlapping common interests with Pakistan. Not because simply because we want something to happen, but because this actually serves both countries. So I'll leave you Zawahiri, but that's not much. But the Pakistanis know well who the others are.
Well, on that note, in deference to Clark's request to wrap this up, so dinner is on time tonight, I want to thank the panelists. Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you all for some great questions.
Thank you, Kimberly, very much. Thank you.
If everyone could take the shortest break imaginable, that would be great. We're going to try to get started on time with cybersecurity at 1:15. Thanks.